Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Today we're talking with Christopher Caldwell about his new book, The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s. Christopher Caldwell is the contributing editor to the Claremont Review of Books. He's a contributing opinion writer to the New York Times. Previously, many of you will have read him in the Weekly Standard, where he was a senior editor and also a columnist for the Financial Times. He's also the author of a great book on the European situation, Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, Immigration, Islam, and the West. Christopher Caldwell, welcome to the program.
Great to be here, Richard.
So tell us, what is the age of entitlement?
Well, as my book has it, it's basically the period that runs between the Kennedy assassination and the Trump election. And I started on the book because I thought it was kind of a self-contained period. I think it's basically the period of the baby boom in power, and I traced the lines along which the country had changed over those almost 5 decades, more than 5 decades. I'm sorry, and focused on gender relations for one thing, on war for another, on economics as another. But I think that probably the line of thinking that has gripped people most has been the constitutional one, because I do present the changes of the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 at their heart, as being a kind of a new constitution, which is kind of proved to be in conflict with older constitutional ideas.
Now let's talk about that, because that's really the heart of your book, is what is inaugurated in American constitutional thinking, political thinking, and social thinking from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You argue we get a new constitution, and I think you're arguing that it's virtually or becomes irreconcilable with the previous constitution. That is the Constitution of 1789 and the Constitution of the 14th Amendment. Those are two things that can't be bridged and produce many divisions, new thought patterns, and new ways of being political and constitutional in America. Talk more about that, if you would.
Yes, I think that the Civil Rights Act does grow out of the 14th Amendment. So I think that has less of a problem. There's less of a problem bridging it there. But, I should be precise here. When I talk about civil rights, the reader should not get the impression that I'm friendly to segregation or hostile to the civil rights movement as it existed for the whole of the 20th century up until 1964. In fact, I'm very much in sympathy with the claims to and agitation for equal citizenship that went on up till then. But there were problems in the Civil Rights Act that were not evident at first. We should probably start with what the Civil Rights Act did. The problem that faced Americans with segregation in the South is that segregation in the South seemed to have been implemented through democratic institutions, and it kept being ratified by democratic institutions. And what the Civil Rights Act did was it pretty much declared the democracies of the South illegitimate, or at least not worthy of self-determination. They had to be overseen and surveilled by Washington. And so the Civil Rights Act gave Washington powers that it had never had before in peacetime. First of all, it created a lot of crimes related to to discrimination. It banned discrimination in voting and in public accommodations and in public facilities.
Education.
It created a lot of new authorities. Yes, education, yes. It created new authorities. Civil Rights Commission, the EEOC, which was the Equal Opportunity Authority. It created offices of civil rights in the different cabinet agencies, and these were enormously powerful. They had the power to cut off funding to states and municipalities, to lay down hiring practices for companies that had more than 15 people. The EEOC had the right to file lawsuits and conduct investigations. This was really strong medicine. Now, there were a lot of people who worried about how strong a medicine it was at the time. But Americans didn't worry about it too much because the problem that civil rights law aimed to fix was so spectacular and so exceptional that it seems to limit the application of those laws. But in fact, as soon as they were passed, they began to deepen. You got new measures were meant to aid the cause of desegregation, like affirmative action and busing. And most important of all, these laws spread to other areas of American life in a way that I think very few Americans had imagined. So you had the tumult of the 60s going on. You had women wanting to be promoted up the corporate hierarchy. You had a certain number of immigrants wanting their children to be instructed in their own languages. And when they turned to courts and said, you know what, I don't want to wait for Congress to vote a law. I want that new system. When they asked that, the courts said yes. And so civil rights spread to larger and larger areas of American life and began to crowd out the traditional system.
With thinking about the Civil Rights Act itself, my understanding, Title IV and Title VII of that act explicitly say that a racial balance is not the goal. That is to say, the goal is neutral principles of law and justice for all Americans, regardless of race. Isn't it, despite what happened, part of, as I read your book, it's this sort of unbridgeable tension between these two constitutions. And yet the Civil Rights Act of 1964, one could easily make the case, was supposed to be colorblind. And of course, but as you note, affirmative action comes pretty quickly. We start getting the quotas, we start getting all of these other things, and then it's easy to attach it. Gender is obviously in the Civil Rights Act. That becomes part of the goal, particularly under Title IX, very aggressive. You also note, and this is something we talk a lot about at Law and Liberty, is the way in which the administrative state was able to act, particularly the Office for Civil Rights, notorious, probably one of the most notorious agencies in the federal bureaucracy for running around the Administrative Procedures Act and being able to govern just with guidance letters. And that being recognized by the federal judiciary as such. And you talk about the origin of busing. Nothing was ever passed by Congress to give us mandated busing. It was, in fact, a guidance letter, I think you argue, which I didn't know that until reading your book. But as I think about your book and this Civil Rights Act, is it what are conservatives to do? Where does this situation leave us?
Well, I think it is, as you say, it is extremely deeply entrenched. And it's not only deeply entrenched, it has been deeply entrenched for a long time. We're talking about a system that is now 50 or 60 years old. And it's worked through a number of different modalities. It's exactly as you say. Quotas were not really, there was no mention of resorting to quotas in the Civil Rights Act, but that was the way the offices of civil rights measured educational progress. And they were able to mandate that schools change, including through busing, in order to demonstrate progress. I think if I had to identify the problem at the heart of it, the reason it could not be stopped from spreading into every single area of American life, is that there was a sort of a short circuit in checks and balances. And this is not an area in which I'm an expert, but there's some beautiful literature in the kind of James Q. Wilson style on the politics of bureaucracy by a Boston College professor, political scientist named Shep Melnick.
Yeah, no, he's been on this program to talk about that. Yeah.
Well, he's an extraordinary analyst of this situation. And what he shows is that there was a kind of a ping-ponging back and forth between regulatory agencies and courtrooms, where you could get these programs ratcheting up with incredible speed. You know, they could undergo, several escalations in the course of a year. You'd have, a classic example that he has studied in detail is bilingual education. There was never a bilingual education law. What you had was a Supreme Court decision that said that there could be a right to bilingual education, and then guidelines written around it. And that's it. And it's still on the books, actually. So I think that there are many, many avenues through which this system expanded. But the thing that they all have in common is that they provided a way to short-circuit legislative scrutiny. Let's say that.
You talk about, as I was reading your book, something that is a perennial topic amongst conservatives, as you know. Yuval Levin is one commentator, Chris Demuth, another one, is the decline and wane of Congress, which you're just alluding to. And as I read your book, maybe the way in which to think about that is the Civil Rights Act itself, that all of the major movement in American government and the way we think about policy became moralized, black and white, and retreated into the judicial, administrative, state sectors. And there was very little Congress could do about it, or really wanted to do about it in terms of these major issues. You argue that the cost of the Civil Rights Act total or surpass, and I'm interested to get how you come to this conclusion, any war or effort like the space program or something like that the American federal government has attempted.
Yeah. I know that the Vietnam War, which was a relatively very expensive war, was not that expensive because the deficit in certain years since has been the equivalent of the entire federal budget at the height of the Vietnam War. We know that when we emerged from World War II, our debt was not larger than the GDP. So I think that we really are. This is a long-standing program. This commitment to social change that began in 1965. I think that's pretty clear.
So let me also, a question that comes to my mind, and I just interviewed Amity Shlaes and thinking about her book on the Great Society. Because those aren't just all civil rights programs, and there's just a lot of social spending in the Great Society at the same time that of this period you're describing, the Kennedy assassination, moving into the 1970s. How does that figure in, and in particular to the size of the federal government, the spending of the federal government, a lot of problems we're facing now, just in terms of just the social spending aspect of this and the tremendous cost incurred there and the ways in which those costs sort of subsidize and promote, I'll say, lifestyles that aren't exactly conducive to independent, free citizenship.
Well, that's an interesting subject. Is the social consequences of the Great Society, but it's not really the subject of my book. I don't.
Well, I guess I asked the question. Yeah. I asked the question because I take it your book really spins, or you start and talk a lot about how the Civil Rights Act starts this new constitution and gives us sort of a deformed republic in many ways, unintentionally so, but there it is. But I mean, there's a lot of ways to think. I guess I asked that question because I'm thinking through your thesis. But there's a lot of things going on here, particularly as we move through sort of the conservative unrest that you also talk about, and we can get into some of your political analysis, but the conservative unrest that elects Nixon, that elects Reagan, and then you end with, right as Trump is beginning to announce his campaign for 2016. And there's all sorts of unrest there. And and it's sort of part of that's the turn against the Great Society. It's not just the civil rights. And so I'm just trying to think through all of that and thinking about just the cost of the Great Society. To what extent is that the Civil Rights Act? To what extent is that something else that's happening? Social spending, et cetera.
I think it's very hard to say because at a certain point, the culture of civil rights becomes the official governing culture of society. So I would have a hard time quantifying it. There's one problem, though. There's one budgetary problem that I think is particularly salient that really came to a head in the Reagan years. And that is Lyndon Johnson built a kind of consensus for civil rights in 1964. But there was never a consensus built for the extension of that regime, that is the regime of regulation and judicial decree, into other areas of American life. And so when civil rights started to affect things like immigration law, women's rights, gay rights, and that sort of thing, you had a large agenda that the country was not on board with, and said it would not pay for. So by the late 70s, you had something going on where you had a very expensive and very entrenched new constitution, but a public that was not willing to pay for it and wanted to go back to the old constitution, or so it seemed. And what happened, I think, under Reagan is that Reagan, to a lot of people's surprise, was not strong enough to overturn some of the newfangled programs that he had campaigned on overturning. I mean, you remember in the late 70s, Reagan had said he could eliminate affirmative action with the stroke of a pen. He could eliminate the Department of Energy. He could eliminate the Department of Education. None of that happened. The constituencies were too strong. But you still had a public that was not willing to pay for it. And I believe that the big deficits that the country began to run in the 1980s are the result of that legitimacy gap in the sort of like new system.
So let me think about that. I mean, because what are the costs of affirmative action, or the cost of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the cost of not getting a job because of affirmative action? Are they truly that weighty, or are you? Okay, go ahead.
I have not calculated them economically. I've just calculated them constitutionally.
Yeah. Because, affirmative action, I mean, I guess, constitutionally affirmative action, one can make an argument that it's unconstitutional. You can also, I think, make a reasonable argument that it's not. Whereas the Civil Rights Act, I think, is you're on much stronger ground. I think in this regard, the Bakke case you talk about, there's 3 opinions in the Bakke case, famous case about a man who had scored in the 97th percentile, I think, on the medical college entrance examination, was denied entrance to the University of California, Davis Medical School. And there's 3 opinions that the Supreme Court gives on his denial. They order him to be accepted. They argue, on one hand, racial quotas are wrong, but race can be a factor. That's ultimately the plurality opinion authored by Powell. Race can be a factor in admissions along the lines of what has now come to be known as a diversity analysis, that somehow a racially diverse student body is a good thing, which strikes me as inherently a racialist type of an argument. And then there are four members of the court in that opinion that argued for the colorblind constitution. So you had two reasonable positions, I think. You had affirmative action to redress past grievance. Then you had the colorblind constitution. Then you had this wacky thing, I would think, with Powell and the diversity argument. And that comes to be a huge moment in our political constitutional life.
Well, when you talk about the cost,
yeah.
Again, I haven't calculated it, but we have what is called in this country a diversity industry, and it has, I would say now, probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people employed in it, and diversity was, diversity was pretty much invented in the Bakke case in 1978. What Powell said is a very strange thing in retrospect. He said, yeah, quotas are bad, but there's a better way of dealing with this, which has been developed at Harvard. It was Harvard's undergraduate admissions that had this idea that the Harvard community ought to be diverse. Now, since the problem at the time was trying to find minorities, and specifically black people, to enter into positions of leadership, you can say that Harvard's undergraduate program probably had an easier time of doing that than any other institution in the entire world. And so to argue that it could be a model for, more local, less prestigious universities, let alone sort of like small businesses and that kind of thing, which it came to be imposed on, was really an extraordinary blindness. It was an equivalent of a let them eat cake kind of thing. Not every business has the leeway that Harvard has.
Mm-hmm. Thinking about your critique of Reagan, which is interesting and worth, I think, spending some more time on. But you argue before that there was enough American voters that really wanted Richard Nixon to challenge these programs and their development that we've been discussing, but that he's impeached. And so obviously that doesn't come to pass. Ford doesn't do it. We get Carter. And then you argue that America was actually perhaps at maybe its most conservative moment with the election of Reagan and the desire to challenge these programs, but he doesn't do it. Instead, you argue, and this was an interesting critique, he seals the peace between those favoring the Great Society and those opposing it through tax cuts and through deficits. Could you talk more about that?
Yes, I think that he pretty much called a truce between two generations, and he did so with, and I think you're right. I do believe the late 70s was perhaps the most conservative time, certainly since the 1920s, and maybe all the way back to the Civil War. I think that there was a
Why is
perception.
That?
Well, I think that there was a perception in the public that the progressive impulse had gone too far, and I think that you can see it on a number of fronts. First, certainly on civil rights. Second, on sex and what would later come to be called gender, as you had people turning on the Equal Rights Amendment, which had nearly been ratified by the requisite number of states, but you started to have states unratifying a constitutional amendment, which is something that really hadn't happened before. And then finally, you had a very isolationist mood in the country at large in the wake of Vietnam. So I think it was a very backward-looking country. There was a call for a restoration. And I should say, when I talk about Reagan as having created a truce, I'd say a couple of things. One is, I think Reagan was one of the two or three great politicians of the 20th century. I do not blame him for accepting that truce when he saw an opening for it. That's what politicians do to build coalitions. And they tend to be more drawn to building the next coalition than honoring the last promise. But it was very much at odds with what he had come to Washington promising. And about the debt, I will say that this is one of the mysteries, actually, that really motivated me to write the book in the first place, which is, there's a basic question about the 1980s, which is when we really started going into debt as a regular matter in peacetime. Really the only time we've done it in the country's history. Why did we have to borrow in the 1980s? If you look at the country demographically, you would have thought it was the very last time in the history of the country when we would ever need to borrow, because we had this gigantic baby boom, and they were all in the workforce. We had a relatively minuscule number of dependent children and dependent seniors, and yet it was just then that we went so deep into debt. So it's my belief that what was going on is what we were paying for was two social orders, the pre-1964 one and the post-1964 one.
So the cost of the pre-1964 are to try and enable economic growth, social mobility. I take it that's the part of the Reagan tax cuts and continuation of the deregulatory efforts that Carter actually started. But then also you've got this new constitution you've got to pay for, which you've got to spend. You've got to spend in deficits to do it. Thinking, a couple of questions that come to my mind as I read, and that was the chapter on debt. I thought was an incredibly interesting one. One though, I assume structural deficits are inevitable once you get the three together: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Not to mention the host of other lesser entitlement programs that come along with the Great Society. So, in that regard, that seems sort of inevitable that we're going to end up there, given that we have these constraints on the federal budget that are largely, unless you're going to repeal them or substantially reform them, they're there. But then also Reagan's desire, right, to build a military to confront the Soviet Union, and also the tax cuts at the same time, which you allude to. In a way, it just seems, given his goals, that upon entering office, the notion of confronting the Civil Rights Constitution isn't on his radar screen the way maybe it should have been. Ronald Reagan dealt with deficits or a federal spending situation of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, other lesser entitlements. He wanted to grow the economy. That required cutting back on very high tax rates. But he also wanted to beat the Soviet Union and end the Cold War, which required high levels of military spending. Was reforming or repealing the Civil Rights Constitution even on his radar screen, given what I think were his principal goals?
It didn't seem to be, no. Certainly when you talk about it that way, it wasn't on anybody's radar screen. And, I talk about civil rights now. I talk about the Civil Rights Constitution. I think that people were talking about it, even in the 1980s, as the rights revolution. And you might sort of say, well, why don't you just call it the rights revolution? It sounds less controversial. You know what I mean?
Yes.
I think Reagan was, I think he was interested in limiting the rights revolution. I think that there was an attempt to nominate, for instance, conservative jurists to the Supreme Court. The reason I use the word civil rights in terms of instead of the rights revolution is that I think that a lot of the arguments for the expansion of this style of government to the transfer of powers, let's say, from the democratic parts of our government to the judicial and the bureaucratic. A lot of the impetus for the transfer came from moral arguments. Should we, allow, courts to, should we allow courts to impose a, consent decree on such and such a municipality that they need more females in positions of authority? And the answer was always yes, because the question was always posed in terms of this being the equivalent of the civil rights conflict of 1964. It was the, women are the new segregation, or as Joe Biden said the other day, transgender rights is the new civil rights movement. So there was always a moral language to this expansion of this kind of state.
Even Richard Newhouse, editor of First Things, couched his opposition to abortion in civil rights language. The push to end abortion was the civil rights struggle of our time, he famously said. You note at the end of the Reagan administration that this seems to ramp up, which might prove your point about ignoring or not seeing what was at stake during the 80s. And your first piece of evidence is the famous episode of Robert Bork, but then also sort of a new energy and strength in feminism, as well as gay rights at that time as well.
Yes, I think you noticed a few things. Political correctness, the sort of like the ruining of people's lives for saying things that were only kind of like would previously have been considered only mildly
boorish,
distasteful or uncouth, like Al Campanis, who was Jackie Robinson's roommate in with the Montreal Royals before he came up with the Los Angeles Dodgers. Saw his entire career ruined when he said, on television that he thought blacks might lack some of the necessities to be managers. I don't know if he meant anything by it, but it was no one was going to give him any benefit of the doubt. That sort of thing came up. You had a very, very, an increasingly aggressive local government in pushing forward new gender understandings in schools. One that I talk about in the book was the attempt to promote gay parenthood in Queens through a book called Heather Has Two Mommies, which in the early 1990s was considered just a laughable excess of the gay rights movement. But actually, whenever these things were litigated, they would come before judges, and the judges were really not of the same view that the voting public was. And so you had a situation where by moving through the courts and through the bureaucracies, activists could get written into law things that were actually highly unpopular, things that really never stood a chance of getting legislated. And so I think the early 1990s was a crucial period, and it kind of came to a head, I think, when Newt Gingrich was elected, and there was a widespread belief among Republicans who did not feel they had really reaped the benefits of 8 years of Reaganism. There was a widespread feeling among conservatives and Republicans that, it had really always been about Congress. And so now that we've got Congress, everything's going to change and we're going to get the conservative revolution that we were promised. But in fact, Gingrich was no more effective than Reagan had been. And it began to dawn on people that real power was in the courts and in the bureaucracies.
Yeah. Also, and I don't know what you think of this, I think it is also the case, too, the left in this period, communism fails, communism loses, and Marxism itself undergoes a change in the intellectual mind and becomes about race, becomes gender-oriented, becomes open to appeals to grievances itself as a part of forming a new left wing. Because I think about the first time I heard the term political correctness, I was in, I think, beginning high school in the early 90s. And as I look back and think, yeah, that all sort of makes sense because the left mind was changing in response to sort of the conventional failure of its ideas and needed to put together a new coalition.
Yes, but everyone, there was a lot of that attitude among conservatives at the time, and I think that there was, people looked on political correctness as utterly ridiculous. I mean, people look at it as a series of jokes, and much of the 1992 Republican convention was that way. It was assumed that the politically correct people in the United States were just holdovers, and that the lessons of Europe were kind of written on the wall. Our left-wingers would soon go the way that the communists had in Europe. But in fact, something like the opposite happened. It turns out that European communism, or let's say the worldwide expansionist Soviet type of communism, had actually been a kind of albatross around the neck of the left. And that once communism was vanquished, people weren't scared of, various, let's say, anti-establishment or countercultural causes anymore. And so it wound up giving them a good deal of leeway, in fact, and they seem to have used it.
Thinking about these sort of failures, I mean, you note and you're alluding to the sort of unpopularity of a lot of this avant-garde cultural movement, particularly in the early 90s, but yet it continues to find success or staying power. And, the famous phrase, moving through the institutions, it's able to ensconce itself. And then it becomes the question of those conservatives who challenge it now face severe reputational costs in doing so. And so it has protection. And then we have 9/11 and everything that comes with that. How does this sort of unfold? You see it in the first decade of the 21st century.
Well, I think that Barack Obama was a very important figure in sort of sharpening the division that I describe in this book.
One question before we get to Barack Obama for you. I'm sorry, George W. Bush, though. How does he figure into these two constitutions, or how does his presidency figure
in? George Bush does not. I should say he does not figure very largely in my book. He, I would say, was a figure very similar to David Cameron in the United Kingdom. He was someone who sort of felt that his own party's ideology was antiquated and was doing his very best to bring it into line with the opposition parties. And you can see that in the only piece of domestic legislation he passed in his entire 2 terms, which is the No Child Left Behind Act having to do with schools. I don't think, so George Bush had a basically centrist view of domestic policy, which is to say that he accepted the powers that had been claimed by courts and bureaucracies in the Clinton administration. And when 9/11 came, as you will remember, that rang down the curtain on domestic policy.
Yeah.
Nothing further happened on domestic policy. Although, if you look at
tax cuts,
if you look at the tenor of Bush's response to 9/11, it was rhetorically very much in line with the idea of expanding rights. Islam is peace. Let's make sure we keep the gates of America open to the world. That sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Okay. And then we move into Barack Obama. You note at one point in the book, he was constantly defining what it meant to be an American by progressive standards and suggesting that if you disagreed with him, you were in effect disloyal, and that he enjoyed playing with fire that way. I thought that was interesting.
Yes. Well, yes. I mean, if you...
We're not going back was a phrase he used a lot.
No, I think that the key thing about Obama is that he's the first president to really understand this new way of delivering rights, this civil rights model of government action as being a new constitution. And he said so even, I think, quite explicitly in his second inaugural address when he paid tribute to
Seneca.
Stonewall and Seneca and Selma.
Yeah.
Basically gay rights, women's rights, civil rights.
As expressing the core of American citizenship. Youth and Barack Obama, I mean, in my mind, the way you watch him proceed, it was always as if to suggest or to drop little bomblets on his opposition in the expectation that they would react or maybe not react, but understand that they were not included in what he was doing and that they were a part of the past. You note in the book, just because people might be afraid socially to express opposition, of course, Barack Obama, there was a lot of opposition to what he was doing, but that opposition doesn't necessarily go away because it's made politically incorrect. It smolders and waits and then comes out at a certain time, an opportune time.
Right. And 2016 proved to be an opportune time.
Yeah.
But I think that in general, I think the public is less knowable than it was before the time of political correctness.
A question that I asked you in the beginning is sort of, where does your book leave us? And I also know you end the book with HBO show, Getting Real with Bill Maher, I think was the title of the show. It may still be on. And Ann Coulter was on the show right at the time that Donald Trump had just announced. And I remember Jon Stewart mocking Donald Trump at length for his announcement that he was running for the presidency. But you end with that as if to say, who's the joke on? I thought the joke is on the elites. The joke is on the media who didn't see this coming, who didn't see a Donald Trump campaign being successful, including many in the Republican Party. And I assume you do that because this would explain these two constitutions most poignantly.
Well, it just seemed sort of a good note on which to sort of stop the narrative. Where I thought that was the point. I'd reached the point at which I demonstrated that we actually had two constitutions that were now had grown so irreconcilable that they couldn't even, that the proponents of the one couldn't really even understand the proponents of the other.
Question for you though, I mean, a lot of has been noted, and you note in your book, a lot of what's supporting Trump though, and you note these counties in rural America, exurban America, largely white, but a lot of social dysfunction, jobs in certain respects having left those areas. Does the two constitutions though explain their plight? And this is something I've thought about as I think about it, the call for an industrial policy to sort of revive these areas with industrial jobs or manufacturing jobs. Does the Civil Rights Constitution though explain all of the social pathologies of those areas, or most of them, or is there a lot of other causalities going on there?
Well, I don't think that anything explains everything.
Yeah, I didn't mean to say that.
But I do think that that it's true that there's a certain sort of non-urban, non-countercultural character in American life, whom we might call the white, heterosexual, working class male, who first was totally ignored for about 50 years by the grand narratives of this country. if you asked people what their country was now about, this character would be the last person mentioned. And I think that as the civil rights style of governing was built out, what it meant is that you used to have, the segregated South required special attention from Washington, and Washington had powers to act really forcefully to govern there. And soon women required special attention, and gays required special attention, and immigrants required special attention. And pretty soon, you had this group of people who were the only people in the country who were not getting special attention. And so their claim to be second-class citizens was actually more than a metaphor. And I think that a lot of the let's say passion that they brought to the Trump campaign, which so surprised people in 2016, was actually kind of it was only a matter of logic that it would arise sooner or later.
You think about the future, I'm sure you have. Let's say it's a less divisive figure than Donald Trump, Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, Nikki Haley. What type of policies do you think would be advantageous in trying to bridge these two constitutions and find a new peace for our age?
Well, that's a very interesting question, but it's not. It's really a history and not a policy book.
Yeah, I know.
Uncomfortable.
I know.
Predicting the future.
I thought you might have thought about it. Okay. Well, Christopher Caldwell, thank you so much for coming on to discuss your new book, The Age of Entitlement. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Richard.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.